Okay, Chapter 17, Manifest Destiny and Its Legacy, 1841 to 1848. This chapter is almost completely about the Mexican-American War and some other treaties that we formed with Great Britain during the 1840s. It's important in the sense of how much land that we get, but really this is the first chapter in the lead up to the Civil War, because you're going to see in the next couple chapters um, the dispute over slavery between the North and the South really gets kicked into high gear because this land that we get from Mexico, they fight over, is it going to be free or slave? That in and of itself is what is probably what the primal cause of the Civil War during this time period. So that's why Chapter 17 is so important, because you got to look forward to the Civil War. Plus, the people who fought in the Mexican-American War, the young officers, they become the generals then in the Civil War, so they're kind of battle trained. This is a picture that you see often on the AP test in your book. It's another, basically, whenever you're talking about manifest destiny, you see this picture, and it's meant to depict the westward migration of America. But manifest destiny it's a vocab term, and it's almost like this mindset, this America type mindset that God had shined upon the American people and on the United States government, and that they are entitled to push westward. And if they come across another country, they're allowed to go to war against that other country. If they come across Indians, they're allowed to go to war of Indians, because at the end of the day, they're bringing democracy and freedom and liberty and all that other nonsense to the land. It gives legitimacy to imperialism. So even though we are grabbing land as far and as fast as we can, we're doing it for good, and God is letting us do that. That's the notion behind manifest destiny. And during this time period, we definitely wanted the entire continent. There's still lots of people who wanted Canada, a ton of people who wanted large portions, if not all, of Mexico, and also there's guys who had designs for the Caribbean and South America. And you're going to see towards the end of this time period in the late 1800s, we do the same thing overseas. We're late in the game in Asia, but we definitely get into the game. So we start with President William Henry Harrison. Remember, he had the nickname Tippecanoe because he was a general in the Battle of Tippecanoe in the Indian Wars a few decades before this, and it was the election was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So he was portrayed as an Andrew Jackson type, and you can see that Andrew Jackson was so popular of a president that the political parties for the next several elections all tried to put forward candidates that would remind the voters of Andrew Jackson. And William Henry Harrison was one of them. And he ends up winning the election of 1840. He is a Whig. So this is the first time that the Whigs, which was a new party, are able to win an election. So that long line of Democrats finally comes to an end. And he tries to show that he's tough. So it's a very cold March morning on the inauguration. He gives this big long speech, apparently without a coat on, and he gets a cold, which turns into pneumonia, and then he kind of goes into some sort of a coma or something like that, and he dies a month into his presidency. So he really was never president, and so he's by far the shortest president of all time. He's also the first president to die in office, and as a result, his vice president, Tyler too, John Tyler, becomes president. And nobody had, since this had never happened before, nobody really knew that Tyler would become president, so they hadn't put much thought into it, and which was problematic for the Whigs because John Tyler was essentially a Democrat. He was a Whig in name only. So here he is, President Tyler gets to finish off William Henry Harrison's term. He gets basically 4 years to do it. He was originally a Jacksonian Democrat, and his beliefs were very closely aligned with the Jacksonian Democrats. But he hated Andrew Jackson, and that was a large number of people, obviously not the majority, but a large number of people disliked Andrew Jackson because they thought he was acting dictatorial. He was acting like a monarch. President Tyler, before he was president, was no different. So he jets the Jacksonian Democrats and he becomes a Whig. Now, he was put on the ticket to try and attract Democrats and independents. And you see this even in modern elections, where if you'll have a candidate who is very far to the right or very far to the left, they'll pick a running mate who is somewhere in the middle to try and attract those independent voters, those undecideds. And the opposite goes true. If you have a middle of the road candidate, perhaps you would choose a vice presidential candidate who is far to the left or right to try and attract those other voters. Um, so here's the deal. I mean, Tyler was not really a Whig, and so he didn't agree with the majority of Whig programs. In this election of 1840, the Whigs take control of Congress, and so you have this Whig-dominated Congress and a Whig president, and so the Whigs get all excited that all their Whig programs are going to get passed, and they don't because President Tyler doesn't agree with the philosophical underpinnings of the Whig Party. So what were the Whig programs? I have here, it's the American System Redux. It's basically Henry Clay's American system. You got to remember that Henry Clay, although he was a Whig at this time, his beliefs he was the next generation of the Alexander Hamilton economic plan. So what did the Whigs want? They were pro-bank. You remember Jackson had killed the national bank. Well, the Whigs wanted to revive it. They wanted to get rid of that independent treasury so that there would be strings attached to the banking system to the federal government. They were pro-tariff. Remember how there was the big fight over the tariff of abominations, the nullification crisis? Well, the Whigs wanted a higher tariff. They wanted to tax foreign imports. The idea was not just to make money, but it was also for protection. It was a protection tariff so that modern this way, the new industrial revolution that was occurring in New England would be protected from foreign competition. They also were in favor of infrastructure. So canals, roads, and this new form of transportation called the railroad. Their big difference is they wanted the federal government to finance this, control it, to create it. So those were the main Whig programs during this time period. Taylor, on the other hand, remember he's a Whig in name only. He's actually a Jacksonian Democrat. So all these bills by the Whig Congress are passed to try and resurrect the national bank, and Tyler vetoes each and every one of them. Congress and Tyler fight over the tariff. Remember, the Whigs want a high tariff. Tyler, for the most part, doesn't want any tariff. And so they fight about it for a couple of years, actually, until they finally compromise on a fairly low tariff. It's the tariff of 1842. And it's far less than the protectionist Whigs wanted. And so as a result of this, the Whig Party actually kicks out Tyler from the party. So the president, for the last 2 or 3 years in office, didn't even belong to a political party. Now, you got sectional differences. So we're going to look ahead now to the next election. So Tyler nominates John C. Calhoun, the guy never goes away, to become Secretary of State. This causes a further divide with the Tyler presidency and the Whigs. The Whigs don't like him at all, and so the Whigs come to become identified with the North, and the Jacksonian Democrats, who now they're just the Democrats, they become identified as the party of the South. And this is pretty much what it looks like for the next 15 years or so. And so you get the Whig Party from the North, which tends to be free, going against the pro-slavery Democrats in the South, and it just causes more and more friction. But aside from that, there was lots of overlapping principles too, with the American system, and expansion, and the tariff, and all that. So it was muddy after that. But what you see is there's personalities, the politicians from each side, they tend to really solidify as pro-North or pro-South, just regardless of the issue. Now, Tyler wanted to annex Texas. He wanted to take Texas into the country, but the Whigs blocked him because under the Missouri Compromise, where they were trying to keep the balance of free states and slave states in the Senate, there was no free territory that was ready to be admitted. So if they would have admitted Texas into the Union, then there would be a majority of slave states in the Senate, and they could have passed pro-slavery laws. So we get James K. Polk. Texas ends up becoming the major issue in the election of 1844. And also, even bigger than Texas, this notion of manifest destiny. So they didn't just want Texas, but they wanted, as much of the Southwest, if not the entire Southwest, as they could. There are still guys who were beating around about Canada. There were some border disputes in Maine. There's the Oregon Territory. And under manifest destiny, which was a really push forward by the Democrats, the expansionist Democrats, it was just grab as much land as you possibly can. The Whigs weren't quite so expansionist. Polk wins. James K. Polk, 1845 to 1849. He's a Democrat, so the Whigs lose. And he runs on a platform that he's only going to serve one term, and he's going to grab as much land as he could possibly get. And there's a few other components, but he ends up going down in history, in my opinion, is vastly underrated. If you look at what James Polk was able to do during those 4 short years, it's a lot more than almost all other presidents were able to do. And he did it just in one term. He doesn't suffer from that second term blues that you see almost every other president, including the current one, go through. So he wins. But remember, there's that time period between November and March when you have a lame duck president. So John Tyler is able to beat Polk to the punch and actually annexes Texas like a day or two before leaving office. So even though the annexation of Texas becomes a huge issue in the 1844 election, and Polk runs his campaign, the main portion of his platform is to get Texas. Actually, Tyler gets Texas a couple days before Polk becomes president. So here are the 4-point plan. Remember, he's a Democrat, so this should look fairly familiar if you're studying what's going on. Lower tariff. Right? For the most part, the Whigs are in the Northeast. They want a high tariff. The Democrats are in the South. They want low tariff or no tariff. So the South loved it, and the North didn't even really suffer from this because the economy was absolutely booming. The Industrial Revolution had been going on for enough time that we didn't need to be protected from British manufacturing, specifically British textiles at this point, because American textile mills were cranking out a high quality product at a fairly low price. And so the industrial North didn't suffer from a low tariff. The restoration of independent treasury. So no more bank. Right? The Democrats were very, very anti-Bank of the United States. The acquisition of California, specifically the port of San Francisco. And the idea is you're going to get a big coast on the Pacific, and eventually you're going to be able to do a lot of trade with Asia. Right? We kind of go back to the very founding of, or the discovery of the New World, where Columbus was trying to find that route to Asia. And 300 years later, it's really no different. We wanted to have some sort of trade with Asia because that's where tons and tons and tons of money was to be made. So if we have a deep water port there on the Pacific coast, that's going to facilitate that. Also, another point in his program was the settlement of the Oregon dispute. There was Britain and the United States both claimed large portions of what's modern day Vancouver and Seattle, that area there. And obviously, as an expansionist Democrat, he's going to want as much as possible. Now, as I said before, he actually wanted Texas as well, so there's really 5 points to his program. I'm only including 4 here because Texas was already resolved before he even took office. Now, if you look at these 4 points, Polk was able to achieve all 4 of these before he leaves office. And that's some pretty serious stuff that he was able to get done. The biggest single event that happens during the Polk presidency is the Mexican-American War. So after Tyler annexes Texas, Mexico ceased diplomatic relations. So you recall the diplomat, you don't talk anymore. Take your ball and go home, that type of stuff. And the reason being is even though Mexico signed the treaty with Sam Houston giving Texas its independence, They always thought that the treaty was done under coercion, because remember Santa Anna did it at Bowie knife point and hiding in the weeds or something like that. And so they always claimed that it was a BS treaty, and once Mexico had the military forces, they were going to reclaim Texas. But you got to remember, this is now 11 years after the fact. Texas was just getting stronger and stronger, and Mexico was just in turmoil constantly during this time period. So Mexico wasn't going to get Texas back, but they also bitched and moaned that Texas is now part of the United States. So now Texas is in the United States. It comes in as a state, and Polk and the expansionist Democrats, they want more. And so you can see here this beige color. This is what Mexico looked like prior to the Mexican-American War. They dispute this light pink area Mexico claimed was still theirs. And you can see it goes all the way up to the Nueces River, which is down here, which is a river in southern Texas, and Mexico claimed that their border with the United States was the Nueces River. So Polk wants California. He wants definitely this area right here, San Francisco, and as much of this territory as he can get so that we can actually get goods to and from San Francisco and onto Asia. So he tries to purchase California from Mexico. So he sends in an ambassador to Mexico and offers $25 million to purchase it. The Mexican government, they're so pissed off at us that they refuse to even meet with the ambassador. So what do? We want California. We want a large portion of Mexico. We want to fix our border dispute with them, and they don't even want to talk to us. So what James Polk does is he actually picks a fight. So he needs an event that will make it okay for him, for Congress, for the American people to seize what we want militarily. So we get war. So on January 13th, 1846, the president orders 4,000 troops under the command of Zachary Taylor, who had the awesome nickname of Old Rough and Ready, to march from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande. And the idea was this. Mexico claims that the northern border with the United States is the Nueces River. We claim that the northern border with the U.S. is the Rio Grande. And I don't know, I think there's like 40 or 50 miles in between the two of them. So it's a fairly small area. And it was clear that the Texans always traditionally viewed the border with Mexico as the Nueces River. But there was enough Texans, Americans living in between the two rivers. There was enough of a history where Polk was at least able to make the argument that no, it was the Rio Grande. And they just kind of hung out there. And we're going to read in Zinn that the American soldiers, pointed the cannons at Mexican villages across the river and whatnot. Didn't shoot, but just kind of hung out there and tried to instigate a conflict. And that's exactly what they get, because on April 25th, so maybe 3 months into this, Mexican troops cross the Rio Grande and attack U.S. troops. They kill about a dozen U.S. soldiers or so, and that was good enough where we could claim that we were just defending ourselves, that Mexico had actually invaded the United States, and so Polk is able to get a declaration of war against Mexico. Again, we're going to cover this in greater detail in our Zinn reading. It's a picture of Rough and Ready himself. Meanwhile, you had this guy, John C. Fremont, had been hanging out. He was like an adventurer, really. He had no official role, really, with the government, but he had been hanging out in California with a few dozen like-minded individuals. Mexico, on the other hand, had very, very few troops in California. And so after the Mexicans attacked the American soldiers near the Rio Grande River, and Polk declares war on Mexico, all of a sudden Fremont and his guys, who mysteriously were heavily well armed and equipped, they capture and kill the Mexican officials in California, and they proclaim an independence. So California becomes the California Bear Flag Republic, and it's in existence as an independent country for, I don't know, a year or so, not even, but several months before becoming part of the United States government. So there's lots of conspiracy theories as to whether or not Fremont had been hired or was part of the American government, almost like a CIA, early version of the CIA, to try and form a coup in California during this time period. In any event, it worked. The details of the Mexican-American War aren't important, and most military events aren't really important in AP US American history. Here's what you gotta know: that it was led by this fat dude, Old Fuss and Feathers. His name was General Winfield Scott. He was actually a veteran of the War of 1812, so he was ancient at this point. He's in command, and the goal was to attack Mexico City, just like Cortez had done to the Aztecs hundreds of years before. So they go on a series of long marches, obviously across desert and mountainous terrain. There's very, very few supplies. A lot of American soldiers die of disease, but eventually they're able to attack Mexico City, conquer Mexico City, and Mexico essentially, gives up, surrenders. So this is about approximately 2 years after the start of the war. The war ends. Ends on February 2nd, 1848, and it ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, one of the better named treaties in American history. And we are, the United States, we're the clear-cut winners in this treaty. In the next slide, you'll see what we get, and it's quite impressive. So here's a map of the United States and Mexico, and you can see here that Mexico claimed all of this, follow the red dot, prior to the Mexican-American War. There's the Nueces River right here. Here's the Rio Grande River right here. So America, on the other hand, claimed everything that's green and then this prior to the Mexican-American War. So in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, we get all the stuff that was disputed territory. In addition to that, we get all of this, which is modern day California, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. And I think a little portion of Colorado up here. You can see here, these are just the different troop movements, culminating in the battles here at Buena Vista, Monterrey, and then down here at Mexico City. And they're, almost all American victories, with the exception of this one little spot over here. Spoils of war. You can see there's a little graphic. The pink area is all the stuff that we get. I forgot about Utah. We get Utah as well. What we also got is a clear title to Texas, where Mexico agreed to stop claiming that the treaty that they had signed with Sam Houston was illegitimate. So Texas is officially clear of Mexican infringement and part of the United States. We also take pretty much half of Mexico, and that turns into the southwest of our United States. You see there California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, a little bit of New Mexico, a little bit of Colorado, and I'm not sure what that other state is. The United States agreed to pay them $15 million for the land. So it sure looks like Mexico should have taken that $25 million deal beforehand, and that was just for California. So they get $10 million less, plus they lose a lot more of their territory, plus all the people who died, and the costs incurred in the war. And the United States also agreed to assume the debts of Mexico made by U.S. citizens. I guess that there were a lot of citizens, especially in Texas, who owed the Mexican government money, and that amounted to $3.25 million. Mexico ends up not having to pay that $3 million. The United States government will pay it instead. Pay attention here, though. You see this little beige area? So this wasn't part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and yet nowadays it is part of the United States. We'll talk about how that becomes at a later date. Impact of the war. So this would be the back of the baseball card. 13,000 American soldiers died. It's a fairly small amount in modern day warfare casualties, and the vast majority of them, I think it may say in Zin, die from disease. It's not through gunfire. But the soldiers were poorly equipped. The food was rancid, and they didn't understand modern military hygiene with their camps yet, and so they suffer from dysentery and other loathsome diseases. The United States grows by a third, so the two single biggest land acquisitions in our history were the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican-American War. And then in a couple chapters, we're going to talk about Seward's Folly, which is the purchase of Alaska. But those events, we just get massive amounts of land, and that land ends up being extremely valuable. The Mexican-American War served as a training ground for the Civil War. Specifically, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant were young officers, not young, but younger officers in this war, and they learned how to conduct mass troop movements and attacks and defenses, and unfortunately they got very good at it, so that when the Civil War rolled around, they were very proficient at killing. Tension over slavery intensifies big time. And I have here the Wilmot Proviso, which you see tested on a lot. It's a bill that never becomes a law. It's similar to the Tea Party's 40, 50 bills that they've gotten passed through the House trying to get rid of Obamacare, but it's never become a law, right? Because he's not going to sign it, and the Democrat-controlled Senate's not going to pass it either. But you have the same type of thing happening here with the Wilmot Proviso. You have this representative, I think he's from Wisconsin if I remember correctly. Obviously his last name's Wilmot, and the bill that he pushes forward is whatever land we might get from Mexico if we win the Mexican-American War, that land will forever be free. And the House of Representatives is able to pass this repeatedly. However, the Senate refuses to sign it or send it to the president's desk, and obviously the president would never sign that. But it becomes a big fight, especially in the House, of Southern reps and Northern reps fighting over it. So every time Wilmot would take the stand to start debating, there was lots of boos and jeers, and they would try and use various parliamentary tactics to try and keep him from talking about it. All right, moving from Mexico to Maine now. So you're going to see on the next slide the map, but at the upper north boundary of Maine, there was a disputed boundary for decades, really since the Revolutionary War, between the United States and Great Britain. Now, if you go north of the disputed boundary, you get the St. Lawrence River, which is the main artery from the Atlantic Ocean into the Great Lakes. The problem for Britain is that the St. Lawrence River in the wintertime freezes over, and so you can't engage in any shipping. And so what Britain wants to do is they want to build a road between the seaport of Halifax, which is in Nova Scotia, to Quebec, which was their major city on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. The problem is this road would go through disputed territory. And it's all just dense forest. And so you have basically a bunch of Canadian lumberjacks and U.S. lumberjacks who start fighting each other in small, very, very small scale battles in this disputed territory, really focusing over lumber rights in this road and whatnot. And it becomes known as the Aroostook War, although it's never an official declaration of war by Great Britain or the United States. These are really, really small scale where like one or two dudes are dying each battle, and they're being fought just by different camps of lumberjacks. So the U.S. and Britain are able to avert a war. You can tell that we're not mortal enemies like we were in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. Now it's the 1840s, and we're starting to become closer, much closer friends, really thanks to the textile mills and cotton trade. And so they pass the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, and the United States gets the majority of the land that was disputed between the two countries. However, it stops short of the path of the road that Britain wanted. So Britain gets its road, and America, as a consolation prize, gets most of the land. And that solidifies the border that we had here in northern Maine. Here you can see the map that I'm talking about here, and this was the disputed territory. All that's blue and all that's orange. Okay. America ends up getting all that's blue. You can see which is most of it. Here's the Aroostook River, because most of the fighting takes place in this valley. Here's the road. It starts in Nova Scotia here. It goes through New Brunswick, follows the St. John River, and here's Quebec. Quebec was the major city in Canada. Here's the St. Lawrence River. So somehow they wanted to get from Halifax to Quebec. And you can see that this is the problem of how to do that if you're British and not start another war with America, because we're both claiming this land. Switching now from Maine to Oregon, and you get Oregon Territory, which ends up becoming a little bit more of a testy uh, dealings with Great Britain, although as far as I know there weren't hostilities that amount to an undeclared war. In the 1830s, there's not a whole lot of people living there. There's the Hudson Bay Company, which was a British monopoly of the fur trade of this area. They're operating this area, and then just random mountain men from the United States. And so there's, again, the United States and Britain agree in the 1830s to have what's called a joint occupation, where they agree to share the land and deal with who's going to own it in the future. So pending future settlement. And throughout the late 1830s and the early 1840s, thousands of Americans migrate using the Oregon Trail, just like that computer game used to play. They wind up in Oregon Territory. Now, some British are moving there, but far, far less. And the company, the Hudson Bay Company, it's not doing a whole lot of business because the fur trade isn't what it was 100, 200 years before that. Now, the expansionist Democrats, especially as part of the election of 1844, they want as much of this land as possible. So they want the far northern border. They want all of Oregon Territory, which include up to the southern border of Alaska. And that latitudinal line is 54 degrees 40. And so they come up with the catchy slogan, 5440 or fight. The British, if they would own all of Oregon Territory, it would go as far south as the 42nd degree parallel, which is far lower than modern day South Dakota, maybe not South, definitely North Dakota, Montana, all that other stuff. So America would take a pretty deep dip down south in the far west there. America, kind of goes to Britain throughout the 1840s, and why don't we just split the difference here at the 49th parallel? That's the 49th parallel is what is the northern border of Minnesota and over there by Michigan and those territories over there. And Britain, being greedy, says no. And so there's a lot of tension at that time period. It looks like there's a possibility it could be a war, but public opinion sours in Britain, especially that the Hudson Bay Company isn't doing very well, and why should Britain possibly get into a war to defend the Hudson Bay's monopoly when it's not even a profitable monopoly? And so they actually come back and agree to set the boundary at the 49th parallel, which basically cuts it in half. And so nowadays, Vancouver is in Canada, and Seattle is in the United States, because they're both fairly close to this 49th parallel, which you'll see on the next slide. So there we are. So really, they're fighting over at the absolute bottom portion. If you go to Great Britain, it would be way down here. And the absolute highest, if you go take the extreme 5440 or fight, it would be way up here. And so you can see they just kind of split the difference right here. And here, this blue line is the Oregon Trail, which takes you to that area. This is a fairly funny political cartoon from your textbook. Looks like it's supposed to be James Polk with a bunch of cannons and bombs and obviously gas coming from interesting areas of his body. And it just gives you the idea of the bloody sword of manifest destiny as the war president seizes as much land as possible. New Mexico, California, Chihuahua, Zacatecas, Mexico, Peru, Yucatan, Cuba. Obviously, we didn't get the last few. By force if necessary. But remember, God wills it. And this is the last slide of the lecture chronology. You can see there 1839, that's when the Aroostook War breaks out over Maine. You get Harrison's death 4 weeks into his presidency there in 1841. You get the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which fixes the Maine dispute in 1842. Polk wins in 1844 in the expansionist Manifest Destiny election. 1845, in the last couple days of the Tyler presidency, he annexes Texas. Lots of stuff happens in 1846 there. You get that lower tariff is finally passed. The independent treasury is restored. We settled the dispute with Oregon or with Britain over Oregon territory, and the Mexican-American War starts there. Fremont mysteriously is able to conquer California, and the Wilmot Proviso, remember, keeps getting presented and passes the House of Representatives. And then in 1848, you get the finality of the Mexican-American War with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.